Buenas tardes, good afternoon for those of you out on the East Coast, and good morning and buenos dias for everybody else who has joined us. So good to see you all, and so good to see you, Charles. Excited for this conversation. As we get started, please introduce yourselves via your chat. Give us your name, your location, any other fun fact, what's brought you to this conversation. We really want you to be part of our conversation. We're gonna keep it lively, keep it informal. This is a book charla, and really, really grateful for everybody who's joined us. I'm grateful for you, Charles, for being here today. Today, the conversation is one of Hispanics in Philanthropy's book charla series on immigration reform, and the book that Charles Kamasaki wrote, The Corpse That Will Not Die. And so I will introduce myself really quickly and get us into the conversation. I am Amalia Brindis Delgado. I am Associate VP of Strategy at Hispanics in Philanthropy. In my previous life from HIP, I worked as an immigration lawyer and advocate for almost 20 years in the US and abroad. I'm also a Venezuelan immigrant and continue to have family that is forcibly leaving Venezuela. And so for me, this is always a very personal conversation. Charles, thank you so much for joining us. We're so honored to have you in part of our Charla series. Your breadth of expertise and thoughtfulness on immigration is remarkable. Almost 40 years with Unidos US and 10 years at the Migration Policy Institute. It's just amazing. And I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about your history working with Latino leaders over such key moments during your career and during really critical moments of immigration reform. And especially because at HIP, we have been supporting really critical immigrant serving and advocacy organizations. Right now, we have 90 active partners in the US and across the Americas that have advocated for the protection of immigrants for such a long time. And their leadership and services are so essential and critical and often go unseen and unheard. And so this conversation is not only about policy reform, but it's about the leaders and the líderes who have been really critical to such movements and continue to be really critical for what we need to push for to see the transformations that we want. And your book highlights the immigration history in the country, particularly focusing on Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, otherwise known as IRCA, and the history of Latino leadership that surrounded it and grew from it. And there's so many amazing Latino leaders that you mentioned that were linchpins of immigration reform then and continue to be really critical Latino leaders in philanthropy as well, including Antonia Hernandez, Herman Gallegos, and so many others. And so we'll get into that conversation. I'm really excited to get there. And and also about how personal immigration reform is for so many of us in the Latino community, and brings us to this work. It brings us to marches. It brings us to legislator offices to continue to demand for immigration reform. And I came to the U.S. as a child, thinking that I would always go back to Venezuela. And my parents, we thought we would go back to Venezuela, and that never was the reality. In fact, my family continues to leave Venezuela. Just earlier this year, I helped my cousin's daughter cross Mexico and into the US, and it was only because of the organizations that were on both sides of the border she was able to do this and do it safely. And the need for a transformation in our system is relevant today as it was in the 1980s when IRCA passed, and so many of us have that story. And Charles, I thought we could start our conversation by really talking about why this work is personal to us. And I wanted to hear from you, why is this personal to you? You've been doing this for 40 something years and just been so critical and now documenting it. So thank you. And what makes it personal for you?
Well, thanks, Amalia. First of all, let me just thank HIP and you for this opportunity to talk about my book. To answer your question, as you might imagine, it's a question I get a fair amount of. I'm a Japanese American working for a Latino civil rights organization and have for a long time. And I guess I would say three things. One is that when we first moved to South Texas, which we did when I was actually entering high school in 1970, I guess I'm dating myself. we had this interesting experience, which was the town that we moved to, Weslaco, like all towns in the Rio Grande Valley, has railroad tracks bisecting the town. And there's actually an ordinance in the city of Weslaco, still on the books, not enforced anymore, that says the north side of the tracks are dedicated towards Mexican homes, is what's in the statute, and businesses as well as industry. And the south side of town is, quote, reserved for Anglos. So when we, a Japanese American family, moved to town in the 1970s, the realtors didn't know what to do with us. And I remember my mother was being helped by a friend who was already here. And I remember a little kind of mini confrontation outside of our temporary housing where the realtor was only showing us homes on certain parts of town, on the north side, Mexican town, or outside of the town city limits. And we ultimately, and I remember my mother's friend saying to the realtor, you know, they're as American as you and me, kind of lecturing him. And so, you know, we ultimately found housing in an integrated neighborhood, one of the very few integrated neighborhoods at the time. It's on the west side of town, outside of the city's original boundaries. But I remember my dad, when we were talking at dinner and my mom was recounting this incident, my dad saying, well, we may be as American as, you know, Mrs. Hart, who was the person who was helping us. But notice this doesn't apply to Mexicans. And, you know, that was kind of a wake-up call of, you know, even after the civil rights laws had passed, you know, Brown versus Board of Education had passed some 15 years earlier, there was still just a reminder to me of how stark discrimination and based on race really was in a South Texas town. And as you know, from knowing history, Amalia, this was very common throughout, not just Texas, but the Southwest. The second is that I was, as I was leaving school, I was in an internship program in political science, and we were placed with small cities here in the Rio Grande Valley. This was through what was then Pan American University, now called UT Pan American. And the city I was placed with was the city of Ed Couch. It's a very small bedroom community, predominantly farm worker. And we were, as interns, supposed to go in and help them. And one of the places we were getting support was from what was then the National Council of La Raza. And they provided a lot of technical assistance and other support to us. And so when our first project that I had worked on came to fruition, which was a little park project, you know, I remember sitting down with the mayor and the city manager, and they were talking about, oh, you know, who should we invite for the groundbreaking? And one of the people in the meeting said, well, we should invite this guy, Isaguirre from Washington. He's with NCLR and he really helped. Well, that was kind of controversial, right? Because, you know, the term La Raza was still very controversial. I guess it still is today. But so my job as the intern was to go pick Raul Isaguirre, then president and CEO of NCLR. My job was to pick him up at the airport. And so I went to the airport, I picked him up. We said almost nothing. Raul could be a very silent guy when he wanted to be. And he clearly had no interest in talking to this intern. But I kept asking him questions. And, you know, he would answer like one-word answers or very short answers. Anyway, fast forward several months later, the head of the NCLR office in South Texas called me one day, and we knew each other because through this internship. And he said, we have a job opening up, and Raul wants me to interview you. And so somehow, even though we hardly spoke, I thought I somehow made an impression, and I was hired soon thereafter, and a couple of years later moved to DC.
Amazing story. Does he still remember that moment?
You know, I have mentioned it before, and this would have been years ago, and he just looks at me blankly. So I assume it made an impression on me, and it was one of the, many moments, forgettable moments in his life.
Great. Those are two amazing stories, and thanks for taking us back there, and also pointing out the mixture of immigration that happened in the country, and the particularly the Japanese American history tied with the Mexican history in the US has been so powerful. And it's really interesting to hear that was part of your own upbringing, is living on the border, living with Mexican immigrants at the time where both were being discriminated against so much. And I maybe, turning a little bit towards what got you to the place where you decided you wanted to write this book. Like how did you get there, and what were your goals in wanting to write this book?
Well, that's an interesting question. It took me from start to finish probably close to 9 years, 8 years. I was still working part-time. I guess the first thing really does actually go way back. And thank you for mentioning the Japanese American relocations. One of the stories I heard growing up, although I didn't really have much of the context, was from people whose parents had been, quote unquote, repatriated in the 30s, or in some cases in the 50s. And they would tell stories about, one day the migra came and said they had to leave. And even though they were American citizens, and they had lived on this land, and they had owned this land, and they owned property and whatever, they were told they had to leave. It was really ethnic cleansing. And I tell a little bit about this story, or these stories, because there were 4 of those repatriations, so-called repatriations, from about the 1920s through the 1950s. So I had some of that background, although not in a real academic context, I guess. And so I went to move to DC in 1982. My main job was supposed to be working on housing and community development, which I had been working on here in South Texas. And the guy, Francisco Garza, who was the legislative director then of NCLR, decided to get married and relocate back to California. And so and he had been covering immigration. The immigration debate had really started in earnest about 1980. And so I kind of by default, I ended up with the immigration portfolio, and I found it immensely rewarding. And I think I didn't experience personally any of these experiences, but I think having grown up in South Texas, seeing how racialized immigration policies had been, I think made me intellectually very interested, as well as emotionally very interested in trying to get immigration reform, the right kind of immigration reform, passed.
And this, I think, is for so many of us. I remember also as a child wanting to understand why. You're always like, why some people and not others, and wanting to get to the root of the limitations that were created around immigration, and why mobility was so tough. Like at a very basic level, right? And I think those early thoughts for me, I realize oftentimes in some ways are the same questions that I have heard as an immigration lawyer and advocate from folks asking about basic human rights and immigration and how can, how do we with our laws start to deplete basic human rights with justifying it through other means, right? Protection, national protection and security, et cetera. And so when we're thinking about immigration reform, there's so many interests and so many things that are on the table to be considered. And ERCA came at a time where the country had been trying to get to a point of reform, and there was a will. And I think what your book points out is these confluence of actors and the moment itself in terms of how we could get there. And I'm curious, in terms of writing the book, you lift a lot of that up. For you, if you could give us some highlights especially for folks who may not have read the 400 something pages that you wrote over so long, and also provide a lot of really great detail in terms of understanding what immigration policy and law is and who the actors are. It's just fascinating for an immigration walk like me. But for you, why was it so important to write this book on ERCA, and what were you trying to really highlight there?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, because I realized I didn't answer the question the first time. On a personal level, I had come to the point of my career where I wanted to do one more thing. That wasn't just being an executive or a staffer at then NCLR, now Unidos US. Not that isn't extraordinarily rewarding. I also have been involved in the failed reform debates going back to just before 9/11 or the 2005-2006 debates where, right, a bill did pass the Senate in 2006. That was a very good bill, was not, never went to conference with the House. 2007, we came very close, and Nancy Pelosi was then the Speaker of the House, had just broken the marble ceiling, as it were. And I have no doubt that if we had gotten the bill out of the Senate, that she could have gotten it through the House. But again, we fell short just barely. And then in the 2013-2014 debates, which again, where we passed the bill in the Senate, couldn't get it through the House. So all this was swirling in my head. And I thought I had something to offer of, very often advocates like other people, when we try and think about what should be our strategy going forward, we look back at our recent failures and we're kind of like generals, right? Where the trite phrase is generals are always fighting the last war. But Capitol Hill and the policy environment and politics are always changing. And I personally don't think fighting the last war is necessarily the right way to think about how to be successful going forward. So what I hope to do through my book was to offer some insights into what our last successes were, not our last failures, but how did we succeed? And not that every strategy or tactic is transferable from the past to the present or the future. But I think some were and some are. And that was kind of my main motivation for writing the book. I wanted to do a lot of other things in the book. And honestly, I probably just didn't have the chops to do it. Very early on, when I thought my book would be published by a university press, I was really given an enormous gift, which was a number of anonymous reviewers reviewed, I think, the first 4 chapters. And, there were some pretty harsh comments. I mean, one of them was like, hey, you've got 5 books here, pick one. And another one, which I thought was super helpful to me, at least, because at that point I was trying to develop different themes and philosophies and make a point about structural racism and and organizational development. And I just had way too much stuff in there. And another reviewer said, hey, what you've got here is a great story. So tell the story and you can work in some of this other stuff. And that was really extraordinary advice. So that's ended up being what I tried to do. It's really not one story. I guess it's kind of like 4 or 5 stories, but that notion of, when I first started, I thought, I don't want to write the normal chronological, this is where it started, this is where it ended. But like I say, I ultimately decided, with advice from others, I really didn't have the chops to do a policy book, a philosophy book, a racism book, and a process book all in one. So I ended up basically telling stories.
And in those stories that you tell, I think you do lift up the pieces of structural racism and policy, and so there are elements of it in there. And I love this point that you make in terms of looking back at our successes, and not just, where I think right now we could be looking back and just seeing failure after failure, and being dismayed by that, in terms of looking at how do we get reform on the table again. And for somebody who might not quite understand what's happening today, particularly with what's happening with budget reconciliation, for me, having done this work, I still had to kind of wrap my head around what is on the table right now, and what are the challenges that are happening. I was wondering if you could get us to this moment today and how you're seeing it with regard to the budget reconciliation process.
Yes, it is unfortunately very complicated and somewhat wonky, but let me try and unpack it a little bit. So there was an effort, some would argue maybe not as sustained or consistent as it could have been, but there was an effort to try and get bipartisan support in the Senate. The House has passed actually several major immigration bills. But the holdup was the Senate. And as I think most people know, you need 60 votes to break a filibuster in the Senate. And there was an attempt to see, were the 60 votes there? And I think fairly early on, it became clear to many of the advocates that there weren't 60 votes, at least for the kinds of reforms that we were seeking, mainly around legalization of undocumented people in the US in various groups. So not having the 60 votes, the advocates have pivoted, and with the support of the Biden administration and the Senate leadership, although how deep that support is, I think is somewhat open to question. But they have switched to trying to put immigration reform into the so-called budget reconciliation bill. Now, budget reconciliation is the same bill that only requires 51 votes. It's the same kind of bills that were used to pass the Trump tax cuts in 2017, the Affordable Care Act in 2010, welfare reform in the mid-1990s. So it's not unprecedented that they're using reconciliation for substantive legislation. But the thing about reconciliation is that according to the rules, which are interpreted by the Senate parliamentarian, the provision in question has to have a budget impact that is more than, quote, merely incidental to the policy change. So in our case, what we have is a quite significant budget impact of over $100 billion to legalize maybe 8 million people. And a couple of those proposals have been put forth to the parliamentarian, and she has declined to endorse them. And her view is that, as she has written, is that the policy impacts of legalizing 8 million people are much too great to justify in light to accept in light of $100 billion of budgetary impact. Now, I personally believe that's incorrect. And I've done some work that demonstrates in multiple occasions in the past, we've implemented something like welfare reform, which, if people will remember, made all legal immigrants ineligible for all public benefits in 1996. Now, some of those have been restored since then, but that was 25 million people at the time in 1996, and potentially every legal immigrant after that, which is about 1 million a year. And the total budget impact there was something like, $40 billion. So in my opinion, we have ample precedent, but the Senate parliamentarian so far has declined to agree. I think there may be a couple of shots left. My understanding is that the Senate, with the backing of the advocates, the Senate Democratic leadership will be proffering a proposal that offers less than a direct path to citizenship, a so-called parole option, which would protect people from deportation and offer them work authorization for a period of time, but would not provide a direct path to citizenship. If the parliamentarian declines to rule that that's consistent with reconciliation rules, then I think the advocates are going to make a big push to urge the Senate leadership to disregard the parliamentarian's advice. And that's something that has been done in the past, although it's extraordinarily rare. So your guess is as good as mine. It's not something that's done all the time, but it's also not completely unprecedented either.
And is there anything that advocates can do or should be doing right now?
Well, I mean, I think given the current situation, what I would say is my sense is this has been a pretty well lobbied effort. Advocates are now putting as much pressure as they can on the Democratic leadership to that if the parliamentarian declines to endorse the latest reconciliation proposal, I think the advocates are trying to urge the Senate leadership to disregard the parliamentarian's advice. As to your broader question about, is there something the advocates maybe could have done differently? And I do this somewhat hesitantly because, second guessing from the sidelines is always, I think, questionable. But I would say that I think we could have been, and the administration for that matter, pursuing bipartisan approaches earlier, more strongly, more firmly. And what we have been, I think what's deterred us is that the price that many Republicans will demand, whether that's in tougher border enforcement, weakening our asylum system, building the wall, or parts of the wall, those are the kinds of things they're talking about, is what their price would be to vote for some form of legalization. I personally think those conversations are worth having. Everybody has to decide for themselves where they would draw the line and when the price would be too high. But I do know that in I think both in 2006 and in 2013, 2014, it may well have been possible to get to yes if we had been more willing to compromise. And I understand why people sometimes are unwilling to compromise. In the current atmosphere, right, a lot of GOP lawmakers are clearly not inclined to compromise or have been negotiating in bad faith. I get all that, but I still think it's probably worth exploring. I have some other thoughts about things we might do differently going forward, but I'm sure we can get into that later.
I had the quote here that you write in your book, that uh, Raul Izaguirre says, and with regard to this strategy, where he says, we cannot impose our will on the majority. Rather, we have to persuade them that it is in their interest to support us. The bigger the change we seek, the more people we have to persuade. And this question around compromise, I think, is always complicated, right? And I mean, for today, our communities are saying "Ya basta, no more." The movement for Black lives, and the resounding call for Black and Indigenous liberation, where our communities are grappling with this history of systemic racism, where immigration has, been so entangled in that history, and our own communities also are confronting our own anti-indigeneity and anti-Blackness. I think, the question of compromise, I think, is much more complicated. And I wonder if, what do you say to that? Like how particularly with advocates being responsive to what their communities are asking for, that compromise seems less possible, and some folks say that makes reform almost impossible, like a comprehensive reform approach impossible. Like what would you say, or what would be your response to that?
Well, there are lots of things involved in that question, but let me try and address those that I can. I would say the first thing is, as you know, I make a case, maybe not as explicitly as I have in other publications, that I believe our immigration system is systemically racist, that it is a classic example of systemic racism. At the same time, as advocates, I would not argue or I would not suggest that we call everyone who opposes change in the system a racist, because I just don't think it's an effective strategy, that if you're trying to persuade people to come over to your side, that you start by calling them, racist. As the larger question, I think the reason why I feel very comfortable holding these two very different views in some people's minds, that the system is fundamentally racist and cannot be justified with but we shouldn't necessarily lead by calling it out and calling its supporters out as racist, is because I think when we're talking about speaking truth to power, just saying what we think is right and wrong, I think it's critically important that we have idealists and people who aspire to, perfection, because they're the ones who are going to kind of keep prodding us and pushing us towards making more progress. But that's not the legislative process. You don't, except in very rare occasions, get to impose your will on the other side, as you quote Raul saying to me. And in fact, even when you can do that, let's take the Trump tax cuts as a good example of, they used reconciliation, they rammed it down the Democrats' throats. I think a lot of that's going to be undone in the reconciliation bill that does pass. And I'm quite confident one will pass, because they're going to reverse a lot of those tax cuts in order to pay for a lot of the programs and services that I think our country needs. So the other downside of taking a kind of my way or the highway approach is when the worm turns and the politics changes, and they inevitably change in this country. It's hard to sustain progress that one has made. And so one of the benefits of the Immigration Reform and Control Act being the product of a series of bipartisan compromises was we could maximize the benefits from its implementation. And I think that would be very, very difficult to do if the next round of reforms were solely and exclusively passed by Democrats. Now, what does that mean in the context of reconciliation? In my head, what that means is we should try and get the most people legalized possible in reconciliation right now. But quite frankly, we have to be willing to engage in a debate on border enforcement and the asylum system. And if we're not willing to engage in that debate, I suspect the Biden administration will, and many people in Congress will feel compelled to, because frankly, the administration's underwater in the polls on that issue. And, they're going to want a resolution. And if advocates choose not to participate, then, it'll be resolved without us.
I appreciate your answer, and I understand how comprehensive it is, and hearing that while we need that call to of truth to power, there is also the need to be able to meet and get to a decision that is sustained. And I think what we saw, previous to this administration was a lot of the work that had been done over decades undone really quickly, particularly on immigration. And I think part of what for me was interesting to note in what you write is the Latino leadership that has been part of this history in all of its ebbs and flows. And I wanted to turn the conversation a little bit in that to that, since I know for a lot of our members and audiences, that piece in terms of building Latino leadership and getting Latino representation and power is part of our objectives in a very large sense. And then with regard to immigration being such an important issue as well, like are Latinos at the table to be part of those conversations? How do we build that pipeline? What does that look like for us in this moment? And in some ways, like, what does it for you? Why did you focus on writing this? And maybe I should have asked one question before the other, but I think for me, those two are really at the top of the mind.
Well, I think we have a different pipeline issue today than we did back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. In a weird way, the existence of widespread, open, blatant discrimination against Latinos in the 70s kind of inured to the benefit of Latino organizational leaders at the time. I mean, I would call out 6 people at NCLR, Raul Seguirre, of course, the president and really one of the founders, also one of the founders of HIP, Herman Gallegos, who was the first executive director of what was then the Southwest Council of La Raza. At MALDEF, not only Antonia Hernandez, but her predecessor, Vilma Martinez, who I think was the growth leader for MALDEF. And then at LULAC, Ruben Bonilla, who was elected president, I believe in 1979, and his first executive director, Arnoldo Torres, were all transformational leaders in a couple of different ways. One is, prior to that generation of leadership, and this is not well known, I think, even in the Latino community, most of the Latino community leadership was pretty anti-immigrant. Coming out of the labor movement, Cesar Chavez is organizing, where undocumented workers were often used as scabs to try and break UFW strikes. The vast majority of Latino intellectuals and scholars, many coming out of the labor movement, were pretty heavily restrictionist in their orientation. And it was only in the 70s where this new way of thinking emerged, where people began to view these immigration issues through a civil rights lens and noticed that Latinos bore the brunt of all of the negative consequences of immigration enforcement that had largely never been applied to white immigrants prior to that. And I have a lot more to say about that. So I focus on on those leaders. And what I would note is these are all super smart people, and they're all still with us, thank God. Extraordinarily talented, but for widespread systemic discrimination, right? It really should have been Senator Gallegos or Congresswoman Hernandez or Governor Bonilla. I mean, this is the level of talent that these folks had, but because many of the avenues were foreclosed to them, right? Vilma Martinez tells the story of not being able to be, interviewed by major law firms. And so she ended up at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and then later became one of the really stellar leaders of MALDEF. So these days, frankly, Latino nonprofit organizations and advocacy groups and trade groups, we face a lot stiffer competition. Not that the job market is perfect, not that discrimination has gone away, but quite frankly, whether it's a lot of our folks are first-time college goers who have to take out student loans to get through school, as much as their passion may want to lead them towards public service or advocacy, right? They got to pay the bills too, right? And if a major law firm offers you a job, but I don't know what entering associates are getting these years, but it's upwards of $100,000. You're more likely to take that than the $40,000 or $50,000 line job that many Latino organizations would be offering folks. So I get that, but I also think, in this time of a focus on public discourse on race, I think with the release of new census numbers that's already started, but will continue over the next year, we're going to find out a lot more about how critical Latinos are to the nation's future. I'm hoping at least that we can do a better job of attracting the best talent. I would also say we do face another structural problem, which I hope we can address in our lifetimes, which is, there are remarkably few well-funded Latino studies centers or courses in higher education in this country. Given the size of the population, given the history of discrimination against Latinos, there really are just a couple of dozen. And it's stunning to me that not every major public university system and every Ivy League school doesn't have a major Latino studies center. And I think that's the kind of thing that can help build the bench. That can help increase and give students more awareness of opportunities that they may have in the public service field. People who work in this field, and this, Amalia, we don't do it for the money, although we've got to pay the bills and put food on the table. We do it for the opportunity to change the world. That's what we're trying to do. And I don't think we have enough of a system within the higher education system to direct and steer more Latino talent towards that choice of a career, which is, I think you and I would both agree, is enormously rewarding.
Thank you for those recommendations, and completely agree with you. And I think the other point to note is not only don't we have enough of Latino studies and that support along the pipeline for folks to feel both that they can identify and feel supported, but also philanthropy is lacking. And Hispanics in Philanthropy has been looking at philanthropy since its initiation and the amount of funding that is going to our communities has stayed at 1% since we've been trying to track this number, and while the Latino population continues to grow. So in terms of how do we continue to build that Latino pipeline, resources to our communities to also support in all facets, right? And when we're thinking about health equity and disparities that exist in health, when we're thinking about education, as you were talking about, and workforce access and other issues, that there's resources lacking across the board, and that philanthropy can also do better, as well as our education systems. And with thinking about also the issue that that we were talking about a little bit earlier, and something that you point out, not only like lifting up the Latino leadership that was important for this moment, but also the importance of multiracial alliance building. This is something that is really critical to the work HIP is doing in our grant making and our funder engagement and other areas of work, but also in terms of the movement building and the policy advocacy that is needed for our communities. And I'd love to hear from you, what examples are you seeing now that you'd like to lift up, or what examples did you lift up in your book that you think are pertinent to today? And maybe just before I turn it over to you, just want to let folks know, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. We're looking at the questions as they come in and want to bring them to Charles. So please make sure to add your questions in the chat.
Well, thanks for that question. As I write in the book, and I spent a lot of time on describing the dynamics of the quote unquote the group, which was a small group of activists that I was fortunate enough to work with, who really kind of steered the pro-immigrant side of the advocacy movement on IRCA and the follow-on bill, the Immigration Act of 1990. You know, I think there is a difference, and let me see if I can articulate it fairly. Back in those days, and this group included a guy named Mike Myers from Church World Service, who went on to be Senator Kennedy's chief staff person, a guy named Warren Lydon, who was the first executive director of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, Rick Swartz, the founder of the National Immigration Forum, Arnoldo Torres and his deputy, Joseph Michael Trevino from LULAC, myself, my colleague, Marta Escutia, who was then the legislative director of NCLR, later went on to become a state senator in California, among other things. Phyllis Eisen, also one of the co-founders of the National Immigration Forum. You'll note this was very much a boys' club up until now, I mentioned Phyllis and Marta. And then really a couple of other really important people. One of them was Wade Henderson, who many people would now know was the longtime executive director and president of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, who was then at the ACLU. Wade's African-American. And then we were helped enormously by a woman named Brenda Pillars, the late Brenda Pillars, who had been a staff person for Shirley Chisholm, who was prior to the IRCA debate, and then went on to work for Representative Adolphus Towns. And Brenda was in many ways kind of the godmother of many Black congressional staffers who by then had started to filter out through a number of other offices. So this was a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational, somewhat gender integrated group. And I think that was an enormous strength. The second thing, though, I would say is we, despite the fact that we had shouting matches and incredible disagreements, and people walking out of meetings and all sorts of those kinds of histrionics, some of which I describe in the book. My friend and colleague Wade Henderson had this rule, which was if any of us is in a meeting, we're all in the meeting. And what that statement was meant to express was that we were representing a coherent whole. And that even if any one institution, because, you know, NCLR and LULAC and at times MALDEF and other groups didn't always have the same positions, and we worked them out internally. But once we went out into the outside world onto Capitol Hill, we were expected to represent alternative views. And so if one of us was less willing to compromise than the others, even if we went into the meeting, we would have to say, but on this issue, the National Council of Churches or Church World Service might be seeking a compromise. Today, I would say we have a lot of allyship that is a mile wide and an inch deep. I think we mouth the words of solidarity and unity, but we actually don't often mean it. And so as a result, we all kind of sort of get along. We don't have conflicts very often that are serious and open, that are meant to resolve issues. We often just kind of slough it off or gloss differences over. I personally think that's a mistake. I understand why it's happened, right? We're in a existential battle on many fronts, and you don't want to have a lot of infighting. But I personally believe sometimes what some people would view as infighting is often just putting all your cards on the table, getting a resolution, trying to help as many people as you can, and then moving forward.
Somebody in the chat talks about respectability politics, and you just mentioned a little bit of that in terms of the mile wide and inch deep, and their question has to do with the historical exclusion of immigrants entangled in the criminal justice system, which similarly is also based on systemic racism and structural racism. And they ask, like, what do we do with this need to move away from respectability politics when we're looking at such entanglement with the criminal justice system?
Well, I think I disagree with the questioner, although I don't see the exact wording of the question. First of all, let me just agree with the questioner that it's a serious problem. The criminalization of immigrants, particularly Latino immigrants, although not exclusively, has been a problem for a long time. I mean, immigration is one of those offenses where there's no statute of limitations. Right, so you commit the offense once and it sticks with you forever. And second, the only penalty is the maximum penalty, which is deportation, or in some cases incarceration and then deportation. That's wrong, and I believe it is fundamentally linked to race. And just to take a little bit of a tangent here, people don't often know this, but there were millions of white European unauthorized immigrants who entered the country illegally up through the 1940s, 1950s. And I'm not talking a few, I'm talking millions. And yet, right, there was a statute of limitations up through the 1940s. As sociologist May Nye has documented, there were multiple amnesties granted up through the 1950s. There were also administrative amnesties that were often granted. And up until 1976, the INS had a practice of not deporting people who had US citizen children. And that practice was banned. That protection, in effect, was banned by 1976 law. Now, what started to happen in the 1970s was that the immigration stream started to change. Prior to the 1970s, it was about 80% white. After the 1970s, by the time you got to the 1990s, it became 80% people of color, and nearly half Latino. And so it's not surprising to me that that's the 1970s is kind of the fulcrum, the focal point of when things began to change. Restrictions on benefits to immigrants also began in the 1970s. Now, to get back to the questioner's question, I think there's an assumption that practicing respectability politics is insufficient and doesn't get you enough progress. I don't actually agree with that. I believe that the major civil rights laws in our history in the 1960s were passed through, quote unquote, respectability politics of the then very moderate Martin Luther King, and the Urban League and the NAACP at the time were being attacked by folks like SNCC and Black Muslims and Black Panthers and others as being insufficiently radical. But at least in my view, and I think the research demonstrates this pretty clearly, the backlash against civil rights wasn't actually a backlash against Martin Luther King or the quote unquote respectable advocates. It was really against, riots and threats of violence by Black militants. And so I don't believe we should hold back in our intellectual discourse of articulating our views that could get us to, perfection or idealism. But at the same time, I think if you want progress, you have to try and get a majority of people on your side. And I think talking at them and calling them racist is not the most effective way of doing that.
Charles, I just see that we're at time, and I want to have a chance to thank you and ask folks to get a copy of your book at charleskamasaki.com. You can read more about our conversation, some of the things that we've talked about, and more. There's so much more in there, and so you can go to charleskamasaki.com. I think we have that on our banner here, and really want to thank you for your time, for your life's work, for the highlighting the Latino leadership and the book that you write, and continue to highlight that work through all of the work that you're doing. And thank you for this conversation and the importance of bringing history and the successes that you've mentioned into the conversation now, to learn how to and see the strategies for us to move towards reform that is needed, much needed now. For folks who have more questions about this conversation, want to learn about the work that we're doing at HIP, please get in contact with us. We have an incredible team of folks who are supporting organizations, are doing both direct services and advocacy, and are happy to provide any support to funders or others who are looking for more information. So thank you so much, Charles. It was so good to talk to you, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you, Amalia. It was a pleasure.